And speaking of like the origin, man, I appreciate you again sitting down, and I want to capture, kind of like the journey of the source. Just hit a little tad bit of what we can, get a snippet of what we would see in the documentary. But just starting from the beginning, they made what you was from DC. Where you?
Yes.
DC.
Yeah.
So born and raised, that's where you grew up at,
Yes.
man. What was your early childhood like that led you to Harvard, man?
Well, yeah. So I'm born and raised in DC, and kind of from an early age, I just kind of got exposed to the music and the culture of the city. I just playing basketball, going through the public schools in DC, and DC is a little different from most other cities in America when it comes to the history of hip hop, because go-go was the dominant music, when I was, in junior high, high school.
You used to beat your feet?
You know about that.
Yeah, man.
All that. I was heavy into go-go. But, certain rap music was played on the radio. So I can remember hearing, Rapper's Delight when I was in 6th grade, and I was, knew all the lyrics to that. And when I heard The Message, that was really a song that really just moved me, and just, just the energy, the emotion, that you got when you first, heard that song. But, I always did well in school. I was involved in a lot of, activities, as well as, doing well academically. So I had an opportunity to get into some of the best schools in the country. So I picked Harvard, thinking, because Harvard's just outside of Boston. I wanted to be close, like, to another big city.
Gotcha.
But when I got to Harvard, it was kind of like culture shock. The people there were, very, very different from, the friends that I was used to hanging around with and growing up with in DC. Very, very different type. Nobody really into hip hop, anything close. But I did meet one kid from Philly, John Schechter, who was planning to go down to the Harvard radio station and talk to them about doing a rap music radio show, because he loved hip hop. And the radio station was playing classical music like 90% of the day. But we ended up getting a radio show late night on the weekends, 1 a.m. It was called Street Beat. And, that was really the time when I fully kind of got immersed into hip hop, because I tried to bring the go-go up there to Boston. They didn't want to hear it up there. People would call in, what is this garbage? Turn this off. And I tried, but eventually it phased out. And, this is 86. So this is what most people would consider the emergence of the golden era of hip hop.
Gotcha.
We had Sugar Hill, we had Fat Boys, we had Curtis Blow, even Run DMC before that. But when Rakim comes out in 86, when Boogie Down Productions drops in 86, when Public Enemy, NWA come behind that, like, this is when hip hop is going to a whole nother level of lyricism, of consciousness, of just much more of a movement as a social and cultural movement amongst young people. So, I got there at the right time, and just hit that wave. And, from then on out, hip hop has really been my life. And I really saw very early on, that hip hop could be something that would change the world in a lot of, positive ways, in particular because of its ability to cross all of the traditional boundaries that tend to separate us in our society, meaning, race, class, regional, international boundaries, all of these things. Hip hop was crossing all of those boundaries. So whether you were rich or poor, white, black, Chinese, whatever, if you were young back in the 80s, mid 80s, like, more than likely you loved hip hop.
Right.
And it was bringing us together in a way that, we'd never seen with music. I mean, rock and roll started with black folks and was beginning to do that, but it got kind of quickly, taken away from the black community and became much more of a white music form with Elvis and the Beatles and things like that. But hip hop wasn't following that same path. So I really, believed that hip hop was going to be bigger than rock and roll. And I created a source initially as a newsletter for listeners to my radio show. I had built up a mailing list of over 1,000 names and addresses of hip hop fans around Boston that would tune in every weekend to listen to my radio show. And while I was answering the phones from people, they always wanted to know information. You know, when is the new, Big Daddy Kane single dropping? And, when's that EPMD album coming out or whatever it might be? And I'm like, there's nowhere to get information for hip hop back then. There was no magazines, newspapers, television. Nothing was, giving us news or information
So
on
your
hip hop.
MTV Raps wasn't even out?
MTV Rap started in 1988, the same year I started The Source.
Gotcha,
so
okay.
It just started. And first, Yo MTV Raps was just a weekly program. A couple years later, they expanded it to make it a daily show.
Gotcha.
So that helped a lot too. But yeah, this was before Yo MTV Raps really even hit. And yeah, so there was nowhere. So that was really the impetus was like, man, I can, send this newsletter out to all the listeners, give them information that I'm learning from my conversations with different record labels. I'm calling all the labels to get the newest music sent up so I can, be the first one to play the new, Audio 2 single that week or whatever the case may be. So, I would get little information from talking to the label reps about what was going on. And then, I could share that through the newsletter. But after it got started, I just really I read a book about Rolling Stone magazine and how that magazine was started as an underground newspaper for rock and roll fans in the 60s. And throughout the 70s and the 80s, it became the voice of that generation. And, Rolling Stone is obviously still around today even, but back then it was like the preeminent, pop culture magazine and brand. And I'm like, this is the same thing I can do for hip hop with The Source. But like I said before, it can be even bigger because everybody's going to read it, white, black, Spanish, whatever. So that really became my vision. The last 2 years when I was in college, I just, stopped going to classes and was just really focusing on building up The Source, began to get it distributed in mom and pop record stores. That was really a big move to get it out there, was to just call up mom and pop record stores in Detroit, in DC, in LA, in Houston, whatever, and just say, hey, I got this new magazine. I want to send it to you on consignment. Let me ship you, 10, 20 copies. And if it sells, then you send me back the check and I'll send you the new magazines. And it started selling, crazy in all the mom and pop record stores. Back in the days, we used to have, hundreds of mom and pop record stores. In every neighborhood, you had a record store. So that really helped The Source, establish an audience all around the country. Then we got distribution through a regular magazine distributor in the early 90s. That got us into all the newsstands and the other places where magazines were being sold, and also got us overseas. The Source is really, it went to probably 30, 40 countries around the world. So there's a lot of people I'll meet today who are like, man, I grew up in Germany and, the only way I knew about hip hop was reading The Source. And, or I grew up in Ireland and, I used to read The Source every month. So The Source really was influential in helping spread hip hop around the world, in the 90s as well.
Gotcha. So with it, when you started that one sheet, did you ever really see it becoming what it becomes, the hip hop Bible? Did you ever foresee it to become that big?
Yes, I mean that's that. When I first started it, the very first one, no, it was a newsletter. It was something, like I was describing. But once I read that book on Rolling Stone magazine, which was maybe no less than a year from when I first started, then it was like, wow, this I can build something that's going to be the #1 music magazine in the world. And eventually that's The Source overtook Rolling Stone in the 90s, became the #1 selling music magazine on newsstands in the world. But yeah, I really saw that early. Like I said, I saw the audience for it. Even though People thought I was crazy. What are you going to Harvard and you're doing a rap magazine and a rap radio show? What's wrong with you? You're supposed to be doing other things and that type of stuff. And people didn't believe in hip hop. If you weren't 25 and under, like that's the audience back then in the 80s that it was everything to us. But if you were a little older, like, oh man, they were looking at it like it was a fad. Oh, that's like some disco that's going to disappear, or that's, trash. This, it doesn't take any talent to rap or to make, produce rap music. You're just sampling things, and, people didn't take it serious. But, me being right there, in the midst of the culture, I knew, people, this was big and it was only going to get bigger. So, yeah, I really did have a vision for where we are today. I mean, in terms of hip hop being something that's all around the world and in all facets of the world.
Absolutely.
Every part of our society, you see the influence of hip hop almost everywhere.
Absolutely.
You can find that.